Our next speaker is on a different subject. Michael Coffman has been with us before, and again, we're happy to re-invite him to speak to our group. He has his university degrees in, let's say, not necessarily the conventional subjects. He has his Bachelor of Science in Forestry, a Master's in Biology from Northern Arizona University, and he has his PhD in Forest Science from the University of Idaho. He is the current president of Environmental Perspective, an executive director of an organization called Sovereignty International. Michael Coffman came to our attention several years ago when he played a very key role in stopping the ratification of the Biodiversity Treaty in the U.S. Senate just 1 hour before the Senate was scheduled to vote. And I think he would agree with me that all of these UN treaties do cut a piece out of our sovereignty, and that's what we need to be worried about. He has a new book, which is available for sale here, called Rescuing a Broken America, Why America is Deeply Divided. It's hot off the press, I think, just in the last couple of days. Please welcome Michael Coffman.
Well, thank you. You can lower the screen. I'm an ex-college professor back in a previous life, so I always believe in using all the mechanisms to gain your attention and hopefully have what I have to say retained. And visually is one of those retention methods. So I'm going to use overheads, or in this case PowerPoints, as we have them now, to kind of bring to you some of the key points of why we are so deeply divided. All right. One of the things that I think is key to this is the realization that we have lost, as David Kaplanian just mentioned a few moments ago, what our nation is all about. If we begin to understand what has caused the division, why it exists, we can begin to understand or take action to correct it. And I'm going to be doing my talk into 3 pieces here. I still can't figure out how to use this particular one. Okay. The first one is why we are divided. The second one is who caused it. I'm not going to talk too much about that today. If you've been keeping up with Phyllis and her publications and so forth, you have a pretty good idea of that. I do add a few things. And then finally, what we can do about it, starting with this next election. I'm going to divide my comments into 2 parts. One is using the writings of John Locke, who is known as the father of our U.S. Constitution as well as the Declaration of Independence, in which many of the writings of our founding fathers rest upon, in fact, almost verbatim in some cases. And contrast that with another philosopher back about the same time by the name of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, if you read the current history books, was right up there with John Locke, basically saying the same things. They want freedom for individuals. But Jean-Jacques Rousseau's concept of how to get those freedoms was radically, radically different than that of John Locke. And we need to understand that because we see it today much of the outcome of what Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote about back in the 1800s, 1700s. John Locke basically said this: the purpose of government is to join together to unite for the mutual preservations of their lives, liberties, and estate, which I call by the general name property. Property is not just a piece of land, your house, your automobile, your dog. Property, according to the founders, goes far beyond that. It is your life and how you can control it and control your own destiny. We have, unfortunately, watered this definition down to the point now where it means that piece of land. But that's not what really property is all about. Because if we want to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as Jefferson penned in the Declaration of Independence, we have to have strong property rights. He goes on to say that the great and chief end, therefore, of uniting into commonwealths are governments, and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property. In other words, the purpose of government is to protect our freedoms, ourselves, our property. That's the whole purpose. In fact, James Madison goes on to say that government is instituted to protect property of every sort, as well as that which lies in the various rights of individuals, this being the very end of government. That's the whole purpose of the Constitution of the United States. That alone is a just government which impartially secures to every man whatever is his own. That's the foundation. And of course, on that foundation, we have the ability to create wealth. Now, we don't understand this, and as a consequence, our current governments over the last 40 to 50 years seem to be doing everything they can do to take property away from us, away from individual control. And you can see by this chart that those nations and economies that have the greatest protection of their private property rights are also the wealthiest. It's a 74% correlation, and the variation within that is very well explained. But the key, the foundation, is property, because you cannot create wealth without private property rights. It has to be there. And unfortunately, as the communists fell around the world in the 1990s, the one thing they did not institute was the protection of property rights. They tried to instill capitalism, but capitalism cannot work without property rights. Now, Jefferson came up with this model, which I thought was quite unique. He basically said, even though many call him a deist, that the foundation upon which our liberties are guaranteed comes from God. God's law, nature's law, natural rights, all of these things are basically granted to us by God. That's where we get our liberties. Then comes the individual. And each one of these, if you look at it from a graphic standpoint, the greatest amount of area covered in each one of these steps is the type of power that is granted. We see the greatest power with God. We see the next greatest power with individuals. The next first level of government, the city government or the local government. And then the county government, the state government. And, oops, I went too far. And then finally, the federal government. Yes, it either works or doesn't work. The federal government was designed to have the least power of all. Why? Because it's the most distant from the individual and the most likely to cause or to take away the individual rights that we have. Therefore, even though Jefferson didn't have anything to do with writing the Constitution, the principles were already established, and he basically said that it is not by the consolidation or the concentration of powers, but by their distribution that good government is effected. So the federal government, if you look at it, is divided into three parts: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. And then below that, you have the state government, and finally, the local government. With the local government having the greatest amount of power, the federal government having the least. Now, why, when we hear the president and others talking about the fact that we must make government efficient for the people, did our founding fathers actually design the government to be inefficient? Ask yourself that question. Because this is a model for inefficiency. But it was done deliberately. Why? Because in order to have basic liberties, you have to have the government with very little power. The more efficient the government is, the more liberties the individual has to give up to give to them. They cannot do their job efficiently unless they have the power to tell you what to do. Very interesting, isn't it? And yet our society today generally believes that we have to have an efficient government because we've been told time after time after time we must make the government efficient. But that is the road to loss of freedom. Also, if you go to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, I'm just taking a few samples because we don't have much time. What Jean-Jacques Rousseau said was that whoever refuses to obey the general will, who is the general will? The government. Shall be constrained to do so by the entire body. In this lies the key to the working of the political machine. This alone legitimizes civil undertakings. What he is basically saying is that the government has to decide what is good for you and I, and then the force of government is used to make it happen. In other words, an efficient government. Property rights were designed by the rich to place new fetters on the poor and gave new powers to the rich, which irretrievably destroyed natural liberty and for the advantage of a few ambitious individuals subjected all mankind to perpetual labor, slavery, and wretchedness. This is his view of private property rights. Now, why would he have that view? When John Locke penned his writings, they'd had over 400 years or 300 years after the Magna Carta was written. It had gone through many evolutions, but freedoms and liberties was already starting to work its way to the average person. In France, the feudal system still dominated, ruled by the royalty and the king. And so the way that Jean-Jacques Rousseau looked at it is that only the royalty could own property, and as a consequence, it created the wretchedness that he saw around him. Makes sense, doesn't it? Unfortunately, modern-day scholars have taken this to mean that private property rights are wretched and must be abolished at all costs. In fact, all United Nations treaties are based on the fact the state controls private property rights. That's how far we have come. The state, in relationship to its members, is the master of all goods through the social contract, which within the state is the basis of all rights. So here we see, in a very succinct way, the statist philosophy. That the state is all-powerful. It is sovereign over the individual. In comparison, the way John Locke viewed government is that the individual is sovereign over the government. Complete reversal of roles. And what we're seeing over the last, 100 years, but especially the last 30 to 40 years, is basically an actual war against the United States of America as based in the constitutional principles given to us by our founding fathers. It is a literal war. It is a war to establish a government not unlike the Soviet Union. And we would have fought to the last man if the Soviet Union ever declared war against us, and we're opening our arms to this new philosophy, this new ideology that will do the same thing to our people as the Soviet Union did to its. It's a war, folks. And we're at the point now where we need to stand up and be counted. Now, let's look at Frederick Bastiat. Someone just mentioned him. I don't remember if it was David or Chris. But Frederick Bastiat was a statesman, French statesman in the mid-19 or 1800s, had seen what had happened in the French Revolution, and basically said this: socialists desire to set themselves above mankind in order to arrange, organize, regulate it according to their fancy. Like Rousseau, they desire to force. Notice the word force, because force is used every single time. It's no longer optional. And you've heard the last two speakers basically say this administration, and actually many administrations before it, are designing policy that will force you to comply to their idea of what should be done and what should not be done. Docilely bear the yoke of this public welfare that they have dreamed up in their own imaginations. I go back to, I think, Psalm 14:12 or something like that, where it says, or Proverbs, where it says, there is a way that seems right to man, but in its end, it always ends in death. And that's what we're seeing in the type of government that we're establishing right now. Frederick Bastiat goes on to say that political questions will always be prejudice dominant and all-absorbing. There will be infighting at the door of the legislative place, and the struggle within will be no less furious. Is there any need to offer proof that this is odious perversion of the law is a perpetual source of hatred and discord, that it tends to destroy society itself? What you're seeing is the fruition of those words penned in 1849 being brought today to the United States of America. We are becoming more and more divided. Why? Because government is concentrated in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. has become all-powerful, that the states have to subsume themselves to it. The local governments have to submit to it. The people have to submit to it. And when you have Washington as the center of all power, this is what Jefferson said: when all government, domestic and foreign, in as little and as great things, shall be drawn to Washington as the center of all power, it will render powerless the checks provided of one government on another, and will become as venal and as oppressive as the government from which we have just separated. They knew exactly what would happen if Washington started to assume this power. Why? Because they had seen what happened in France with the French Revolution. Jefferson and many of the other founders, Patrick Henry, lauded the French for the revolution until they went over there and saw exactly what it represented, because they were following the model of the Rousseau form of governance. And it was bloody. It did not give freedom to the people. It put the people under a different kind of tyranny than they had just had before. So when Jefferson came back, he penned these words: when all government is centralized, you have the ability to corrupt power. And it will be corrupted every single time. The ability to hand out favors to one group and take them away from another. That's why they did not want to have the federal government have much power, because they realized it would be corrupted and it would never allow the people to have the freedoms that they wanted them to have. I got to make a choice here. I'm going to go one more slide and see where we are. We're running out of time. What we see now is basically the inverse of what Jefferson saw as the perfect kind of government, the people's model. This is the feudal ruler model as outlined by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, where you have the most power with the federal government, who basically has power over the state government, which has power over the local government, and the least power of all is with the people themselves. This is what is facing us. I'm out of time. I've only covered the first part of the book, but I think in some cases the most powerful part. I've had liberals read this book and have gone into the state of shock as they realize how they have been deceived. It's interesting that the Progressive Party, the Democrats, or the liberals within the Democrats, have such a warped concept of what is real and not real. You just heard Chris Horner talk about the fact that cap and trade legislation, all this green energy, is extremely destructive. And he just touched the surface of it. I conducted multi-million-dollar research in global warming and its effects on our nation's ecosystems and got into the politics of a lot of this. It is a destructive mechanism. Now, those who are in positions of power know how it's destructive and are doing it deliberately. But you have many people who call themselves liberals or progressives that believe this in spite of all the evidence to the contrary. I'm a scientist. I've led multi-million-dollar research efforts in global warming. There is no empirical evidence that man is causing global warming. None. And yet we persist on continuing to think that man is going to destroy the earth. Why? One, because global warming and the cap and trade legislation has nothing to do with the environment or protecting the environment. It has everything to do with power, being able to control your life and my life. But even so, there are many people out there that are deceived because of their public education, because of a number of things, the media. How can you know the truth when you have a media that will not give you the truth? You can't. And as David just said a moment ago, we need to help those people understand what is really happening, because most of them are intelligent. Most of them, if they're presented with the truth in a way that does not build barriers, in other words, don't call them a liar or something of that nature, they will begin to understand. Many of them are seeing that right now. That's why we see the popularity of Obama plummeting at this particular point in time, because he's being found out that all his great wisdom and so forth is nothing more than hot air. We have a responsibility in this upcoming election, and I really would encourage you and charge you as students to get active in your colleges and begin to try to reach out and create constituencies to hopefully put into office people of integrity and people who understand why our nation was founded on the principles that it was founded on. It's imperative. Personally, I don't think we can stand another 2 years of what we've just seen the last year and a half. I think our nation will almost be taken over by this philosophy, our Constitution useless. In the end of the book, I have a small section, well, 2 chapters, I guess that's not too small, on defining a mechanism using existing federal and state law. It is powerful, because almost all federal law and most state law have in it provisions of coordinating the state or federal activity with the local government. It's never been used, but it's there. In over 60 governmental jurisdictions, local governmental jurisdictions, county, cities, school districts even water districts, have been able to use those provisions to block some of the activities of the federal government or the state government. I don't know how many of you might know of the Trans-Texas Highway. A quarter of a mile wide right-of-way, 6 lanes each direction, along with railroad, utilities, power, and so forth, truncating, dividing the United States in half. That's only the start. It'll be in many other places too. That is totally borderless. from the southern part of Mexico to Canada and into Canada. Two little small jurisdictions. One was a school district, the other one was a water district. Used the state law language and totally blocked a multi-billion-dollar effort to build the Trans-Texas Highway last year. It does work. And we have the opportunity of beginning to take back local jurisdiction using this law. Questions?
Hi there. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to ask a second question. My question for you is, I've been going around to tea parties. I've been trying to do lots of community organizing from a more conservative aspect than our president in Maryland. And one thing that we've seen a rise in is people actually talking about political ideology and political theory, like Locke. Some people talking Rousseau, thinking like Rousseau too. But I'm concerned is how can we keep this up, and especially on our college campuses, a lot of us here who I'm assuming are organizers on their campuses, it's really difficult to keep talking about political theory on campuses. Students get bored with it. Do you have any ideas as to how to keep that discussion going? I think it's one of the most important discussions we can have.
Well, I think one of the things that we really need to focus on in the college campus is not so much the theory. The theory is boring. You know, when I was going to school, history was the last thing on my mind. History was, it was there, but who cared? Many of you still might have that same opinion, although I doubt that it's very prevalent in this group. Yet it is key that we understand that Phyllis has written many, many times how important the knowledge of our history is. And we need to get that installed. But I would not start with that as a starting point. If you have a discussion on something maybe like cap and trade or something of that nature that's generating a lot of discussion, a lot of antagonism, use that as your springboard and ask them, challenge them. Why do you think a state-run solution is the solution? Let them take the lead. And then begin to show how that is wrong and why our nation, especially why our nation was built the way it was. That will give you the inroad, at least I think it will, the inroad into being able to reach them at a level that they can understand without just turning them off.
Giving one other answer to that question, you can go on Eagle Forum's website and pick up our alerts, which will be timely about currently discussed legislation, and just use that as a springboard for all the other things Dr. Coffman's talking about. Another question.
Hi, thanks for speaking today. I was wondering if you think it's important to note the similarities, I guess, between Rousseau and our founding fathers, especially Thomas Jefferson, and that I understand that the social contract can be interpreted differently, as obviously Marx did. Right.
It is, I think, very critical to understand that much of what Jean-Jacques Rousseau said parallels very closely with John Locke. In other words, they were both basically after the freedom of man, or the individual. How they got there was radically different. And I think the easiest way for you to be able to penetrate that in basically saying, why then did Karl Marx, John England, John Hegel, or not John, but Friedrich Hegel, why did all of them base their initial assumptions on the writings of Rousseau and not Locke? Because basically the way Locke comes at it will always lead to socialism, fascism, or communism.
I totally understand that. I think that often it's overlooked the difference between general will and particular will, and I think that general will, in which Rousseau focuses on, leads to the democracy we have today, and I think that they incorrectly focus on particular will over that.
Right. Let me just follow up with that. I meant to say it during my talk. You realize, I don't think you're telling anything new here, that we're not a democracy, we're a republic, for a very good reason. And remember this, it's a good catchphrase, it'll just flatten people. Democracy is no more than two wolves and a lamb deciding on what to have for dinner. If you can get that concept across, all of a sudden you're going to open up the mind of whoever was believing that democracy is what we should have.
All right, one more.
Thank you for coming. I'm curious to know, it used to be in this country that the members of the legislature in the federal government were chosen by the state legislature.
Yes.
How do you feel about institutions like that in this country, and how do you feel like should anything be reorganized to that
Should we
system
abolish
again?
the 16th Amendment, in other words?
Yeah.
It is, you have to be careful how you do this. In fact, I don't want to tamper with the Constitution at all because you open up a can of worms. But on the other hand, the whole purpose of having states elect the senators and not the individuals is because of states' rights. And it's very, very important that we get back to the principles of states' rights in the 10th Amendment. And the whole issue of how to do that without going or basically nullifying the 16th Amendment can be quite difficult. And I'm glad to see that the 10th Amendment is becoming part of the headlines today as states begin to buck back what the federal government's doing. I think that is probably the easier course ultimately if we ever can condemn. One of the things that is in my book, you'll see it's very much downplayed, but it's there, is if you actually look at all of these opposing sides and see, well, you're not American and you're not American, you're un-American and so forth. What you find is that this new ideology that is permeating our government right now is un-American, by definition. True, you have Americans in it, but they are not following the principles that made this nation great.
All right. Thank you, Mike Coffman.